The 1968 Formula One season featured the 19th World Championship of Drivers, the 11th International Cup for F1 manufacturers, and 3 non-championship races open to Formula One cars. The World Championship was contested over 12 races between the 1st of January and the 3rd of November 1968. Great Britain driver Graham Hill, driving a Lotus-Ford Cosworth, won his second Drivers' Championship, 6 years after his first. Lotus were awarded the Manufacturers' Cup for the 3rd time. Repco produced a more powerful version of their V8 to help Brabhams compete against Ford's new Cosworth DFV, but it proved very unreliable. Jochen Rindt qualified on pole position twice, but also only finished twice. Hill's main rivals were Jackie Stewart at Tyrrell Matra and 1967 champion Denny Hulme at McLaren. The 1968 season turned out to be a turning point in terms of safety, with 4 Grand Prix drivers being involved in fatal crashes: two-time world champion Jim Clark, Mike Spence, Joe Schlesser and Ludovico Scarfiotti. It was the last year where all the races were run on tracks with almost no safety modifications. In this season, after receiving offers from every team bar 2, Jochen Rindt signed with 1967 champions Brabham. Reigning Drivers' champion Denny Hulme moved to Bruce McLaren's team after Lotus lost its exclusive right to use Cosworth DFV engines. McLaren also started using Cosworth instead of Brabham. Scuderia Ferrari ran Chris Amon as their only full-time driver in 1967, but attracted Jackie Stewart for this year. Ken Tyrrell entered F1 with Matra International, a joint venture between Tyrrell Racing and car manufacturer Matra. They signed 1967 runner-up Jackie Stewart. Matra kept running their factory team as well, powered by their own V12s. Brabham signed Pedro Rodriguez to replace Stewart. With Rindt, Ickx and Rodriguez gone, Cooper needed a complete new driver lineup, which they found in Formula 2 driver Brian Redman and longtime Ferrari employee Ludovico Scarfiotti. The team switched from Maserati engines to take over McLaren's contract with Brabham. Jim Clark was killed in a racing accident during the 1968 Deutschland TROPHE Formula 2 race. A devastated Colin Chapman drew an F2 driver Jackie Oliver to fill the seat. Chapman lost his Indianapolis 500 driver Mike Spence when he crashed during practice for the 1968 event. In F1, Spence had been driving for Brabham, who signed Richard Atwood to replace him. Later in the year, Bobby Unser, winner of that year's Indy 500, took the seat. Both of Cooper's drivers were involved in serious crashes. Redman exited the Belgian Grand Prix with a broken arm, while Scarfiotti would suffer a fatal crash at a hill-climbing race in Germany. The team then hired Lucien Bianchi and Vic Elford. Joe Schlesser was signed by Honda to drive the experimental air-cooled RAE 302, which Works driver John Surtees had refused. In just his debut race, the French Grand Prix, local hero Schlesser crashed on the second lap. The fully fueled car exploded instantly. Both Matra teams expanded to 2 cars near the end of the year. The French team promoted F2 driver Henry Pescarolo, and the British team went for F3 driver Johnny Servo's Gavin. Dan Gurney, founder and driver from Anglo-American Racers, switched from his own Eagle chassis to a customer McLaren chassis, powered by a Cosworth DFV. On the topic of technology, the 1968 headlines were dominated by the wings introduced by Lotus owner Colin Chapman. He installed modest front wings and a rear spoiler on his Lotus for 9B at the 1968 Monaco Grand Prix. Brabham and Ferrari went one better at the 1968 Belgian Grand Prix with full-width wings, mounted on struts high above the driver. Lotus replied with a full-width wing directly connected to the rear suspension that required a redesign of the wishbones and transmission shafts. Matra then produced a high-mounted front wing connected to the front suspension. This last innovation was mostly used during practice as it required a lot of effort from the driver. By the end of the season, most teams were using sophisticated wings. Dan Gurney became the first driver to wear a full-face helmet at the 1968 German Grand Prix. He had helped to invent it with the Bell Helmets Company, and had already used it at the 1968 Indianapolis 500. Within some years, it became the obvious choice among drivers and was later deemed mandatory. All cars had to be fitted with a rollbar that stretched out to at least 5 centimeters above the driver's helmet, an electrical circuit breaker, an oil catch tank and a reverse gear, and the cockpit had to allow easy evacuation. The FIA decided to permit unrestricted sponsorship on cars after the withdrawal of support from automobile-related firms like BP, Shell and Firestone. Team Gunston, a South African privateer team, was the first Formula One team to paint their cars in the livery of their sponsors when they entered a private Brabham for John Love, painted in the colors of Gunston Cigarettes, in the 1968 South African Grand Prix. In the next round at the 1968 Spanish Grand Prix, Team Lotus, initially using the British racing green, became the first works team to follow this example, with Graham Hill's Lotus for 9B entered in the red, gold and white colors of the Imperial Tobacco's Gold Leaf brand. Let's start with the theme tune, and begin telling the story of this fantastic Formula One season run in 1968. The fast and flowing Kyalami circuit between Johannesburg and Pretoria played host to the South African Grand Prix for the second time, on New Year's Day 1968. Briton Jim Clark was fastest by a second with his Lotus-Ford Cosworth teammate Graham Hill alongside him, with Jackie Stewart in the new Matra Ford Cosworth completing the front row. On the second row, there were the two Brabham Repcos of Austrian Jochen Rindt and Australian Jack Brabham, while the third row featured Briton John Surtees in the Honda, and the Ferraris of Italian Andrea Di Adamic in a third car, and New Zealander Chris Amon. The race began with Stewart taking the lead from Clark, while Hill dropped back to 7th behind Rindt, Surtees, Brabham and Amon. On the second lap, Clark took the lead while Brabham overtook Surtees, and Hill passed both Amon and Surtees to run 5th. Further back there was drama when Italian Ludovico Scarfiotis Cooper Maserati suffered a water leak, and the driver was scalded by the escaping hot water. He was taken to hospital with first-degree burns. On the 7th lap, Brabham overtook Rindt for 3rd place, but soon afterwards he ran into engine trouble and dropped back, leaving Rindt 3rd again. He came under threat from Hill, and on lap 13 the Englishman moved to 3rd place. Amon moved into 5th place, having overtaken Surtees on the same lap. The order remained stable as Hill chased and caught Stewart, and on lap 27, he moved ahead. Stewart stayed with him until lap 43 of 80, when the Matra retired with a connecting rod failure. This moved Rindt to 3rd once again, and the order then remained unchanged all the way to the finish, with Lotus scoring a dominant 1 to finish with Rindt 3rd. Clark won his 25th and last championship Grand Prix from teammate Graham Hill, an Austrian Jochen Rindt in a Brabham. Clark broke Juan Manuel Fangio's 10.5-year record of 24 Grand Prix victories, and would go on to hold this record until his countryman and friend Jackie Stewart broke the record in 1973. Many F1 drivers in the 1960s went to compete in the Tasman Series in New Zealand and Australia during the European winter and the Southern Hemisphere summer, which was a 9-week, 8-race series that started in early January and ended in late February, early March, with respective races every week in open-wheel racing cars that were very similar to F1 cars of the time, with exactly the same chassis, only these variants had 2.5 litre engines, as opposed to Formula One World Championship cars, which had 3 litre engines. The non-championship race of champions, at the English Brands Hatch circuit near London in March, was won by Bruce McLaren in his own McLaren car, ahead of Mexican Pedro Rodriguez in a BRM, and McLaren's teammate and countryman Denny Hulme. The BRDC International Trophy race at the Silverstone circuit in England was another non-championship race held 5 weeks after the Race of Champions. The race was won by Hulme in a McLaren, ahead of fellow New Zealanders McLaren and Chris Amon in a Ferrari. On the 7th of April, Jim Clark, one of the most successful and popular drivers of all time, was killed at Hockenheim in West Germany at a non-championship Formula 2 event. The Scotsman had gone off the track caused by what was believed to be a deflating rear tire. 90% of the Hockenheim circuit was made up of too long, slightly curving straights running through thick forests, and because there was no protection from the solid trees lining the circuit on both sides, Clark's Lotus smashed into a wall of trees, breaking the Scotsman's neck and killing him instantly. The car was totally destroyed. There was a 4-month gap between the South African Grand Prix in January and the Spanish Grand Prix in May. Formula One had lost yet another driver. Briton Mike Spence died 4 days after a practice accident at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway while running one of Andy Granatelli's Lotus turbines, when he hit the wall at turn 1 and one of the wheels came back into his cockpit and hit him on the head. The first Spanish Grand Prix since 1954 was held at the brand new, ultra-modern Jarama circuit just north of the Spanish capital city of Madrid, having held a non-championship race in 1967, which Jim Clark won. Jackie Stewart had to miss this race due to a wrist injury. Amon took pole. In the race, Rodriguez took the lead from Frenchman Jean-Pierre Belpouz, Hulme and Hulme. The top three remained unchanged in the early laps, but on lap 12 Beltels took the lead in his Matra Ford. As he did so, the Frenchman's car began smoking, and on lap 16 he dropped out, leaving Hulme, who had overtaken Rodriguez, in the lead. For the next 30 laps, the New Zealander was ahead while Rodriguez shadowed him until he lost control on lap 28 and crashed. This put Hill into second place with Hulme third and Surtees fourth. On lap 58, Hulme's fuel pump failed and so Hill took the lead, and went on to win from Hulme and his promising countryman Brian Redman in a Cooper BRM. It was only a year since Lorenzo Bandini had been killed at Monaco, so the chicane was tightened and the race was shortened by 20 laps. Ferrari did not attend amid reports that the team was not happy with the safety standards at the circuit. Team Lotus was there, however, and Graham Hill and Jackie Oliver ran in the new red and gold livery of Gold Leaf, and the cars featured the first hints of aerodynamic front and rear wings. BRM had been planning to run Briton Chris Irwin as Mike Spence's replacement, but in practice for the NRBURGRING 1000 km Sportsker race, the previous weekend Irwin had flipped an Alan Manford F3L Sportsker at the Flugplatz section, and had suffered serious head injuries. Irwin never raced again, so Reg Parnell Racing's Richard Atwood was promoted to the works team. Jackie Stewart was still out of action, with a wrist injury from the Jarama F2 race a month earlier, and so his place in the Matra International team was taken by F1 debutant Johnny Servo's Gavin. Jean-Pierre Beltels appeared with the new Matra V12 engine in the back of his Matra Sports entry. Brian Redman was busy racing for the Gulf John Wyer team at the Spa 1000 km Sportsker race, and his place with Cooper was taken by Belgian Lucien Bianchi. Denny Hulme was also being kept busy as he jetted backwards and forwards to Indianapolis qualifying. Qualifying at Monaco resulted in pole position by 0.6 seconds for Hill with an impressive Frenchman Johnny Servo's Gavin alongside him on the front row. The second row featured Joe Siffert in Rob Walker's Lotus and John Surtees in the Honda with Brabham's Jochen Rindt and Atwood on the third row. Then came Bruce McLaren and Beltels, Pedro Rodriguez, BRM, and Hulme. At the start Servo's Gavin took the lead, but after 3 laps, he suffered a driveshaft failure and crashed. This left Hill in the lead, and there he stayed for the rest of the afternoon. The first few laps saw a number of accidents, with Oliver and McLaren colliding on the first lap. Jochen Rindt, Brabham, crashing on lap 9 while trying to pass Surtees. Brabham, then Gurney and Siffert all went out with mechanical trouble, while Beltels broke his suspension running over a curb, and Piers Courage, Reg Parnell Racing BRM, stopped because his car was handling so badly. Surtees then disappeared with a gearbox failure, and on the same lap Rodriguez crashed, and so only 5 cars were left by the end of lap 16. As a result, the excitement was limited, although third-placed Hulme stopped in the mid-race to have a driveshaft replaced and dropped to 5th, leaving Bianchi to finish third behind Hill and Atwood with Lodovico Scarfiotti fourth in the second Cooper BRM. Formula One arrived at the fastest circuit of the year, the notoriously dangerous and challenging 14 km Spa-Francorchamps circuit in Belgium. Hulme took pole at an average speed of more than 240 km/h around this unprotected rural road circuit, an incredible average speed by even today's standards. The appearance of wings on the Lotus at Monaco did not go unnoticed, and for this race, various teams arrived with experimental wings on their cars. Ferrari was back in action, having missed Monaco, and entered 2 cars for Chris Hulme and Jackie X. Jackie Stewart was back in action for Ken Tyrrell's Matra International team, and Lucien Bianchi stayed with the Cooper BRM team, replacing Lodovico Scarfiotti. As the Italian was committed to racing in the European Hilkland Championship event at Rossfeld in southern Germany in a Porsche 908, American Dan Gurney and Kiwi Denny Hulme had flown back from Indianapolis, having finished 2nd and 4th in the race. Hulme was fastest in practice on Friday with Stewart and X alongside him on the front row. Then came John Surtees in the Honda and Hulme with Bruce McLaren, Piers Courage, Reg Parnell Racing BRM, and Pedro Rodriguez, BRM, sharing the third row. Both Lotus drivers had trouble, and were on the penultimate row of the grid. Saturday was completely ruined by rain and by the news from Rossfeld that Scarfiotti had been killed. The Italian Scarfiotti was the 3rd Grand Prix driver to die in 2 months. This was turning into the bloodiest year in the history of Grand Prix racing since its origins in the 1900s. Race day was dull and overcast, and at the start Hulme took the lead with X, Surtees and Hulme chasing him. By the end of the second lap Surtees had taken the lead. There were a rash of retirements early on, with Hill, Richard Atwood, BRM, Brabham and Rindt all going out with mechanical trouble. On the 7th lap, Brian Redman, Cooper BRM, went out when his suspension failed near Les Combes, and he crashed violently into a concrete barrier, then went over the barrier and into a parked Ford Cortina road car. The Cooper caught fire, but Redman escaped with a badly broken right arm and a few minor burns. He did not race for most of that year. Soon afterwards, Hulme went out with a radiator problem, and then the leader Surtees disappeared when his suspension failed. This left Hulme in the lead, but he was quickly overtaken by Stewart, and the two diced until Hulme slowed with a driveshaft problem. This left Stewart half a minute clear of McLaren, but on the penultimate lap the Matra Ford driver ran out of petrol and dropped behind McLaren, Rodriguez and Ickx. This was the McLaren team's first ever F1 victory, and Bruce McLaren's first championship Grand Prix victory since the 1962 Monaco Grand Prix. Bruce also became only the third driver to win a race in a car manufactured by his own team, Jack Brabham having done it in 1966 and Dan Gurney in 1967 at Spa-Francorchamps.